Mr. Harrison, I will ask you one final time. Judge Walter Brennan's voice dripped with theatrical authority. Do you understand that your continued silence constitutes contempt of this court? Marcus Harrison, 79 years old, sat at the defense table with the stillness of a mountain. His weathered hands, scarred and calloused from decades of honest work, rested flat on the polished wood. He wore a simple button-down shirt, faded jeans and work boots, the same outfit he'd worn to his granddaughter's college graduation last month. He wasn't looking at the judge. His dark brown eyes, still sharp despite his age, were fixed on the American flag, hanging limply in the corner of the windowless courtroom. His court-appointed attorney, a young woman named Lisa Chen, fresh out of law school, shifted nervously in her chair. Your Honor, my client has answered every question posed to him. He's simply exercising his right. His right? Judge Brennan interrupted, his jowls quivering with indignation. His right to waste this court's time. His right to treat these proceedings like a joke. The charge was absurd. Marcus had been cited for disturbing the peace after an altercation at a local diner. The truth was simple. He'd intervened when he saw a man verbally abusing a waitress, threatening her. The man, as it turned out, was the nephew of the county commissioner. The responding officers had arrested Marcus instead. When the prosecutor offered a plea deal, admit guilt, pay a fine, mandatory anger management classes, Marcus had refused. Not because he was stubborn, but because he would not lie, would not admit to something he didn't do. Judge Brennan leaned back in his oversized leather chair, a king on his throne. You know what I see, Mr. Harrison? I see an old man who thinks his age gives him special privileges, that somehow being elderly means the rules don't apply to you. He gestured dramatically to the sparse gallery. A few court employees, a local reporter bored out of her mind. People like you come into my courtroom every week. Grumpy old men who've decided society owes them something. That because you've been around the block a few times, you can do whatever you want. Lisa Chen stood up. Your Honor, that's completely sit down, counselor, or you'll join him in contempt. The judge's face was flushed red now. He was enjoying this. The power, the dominance. Marcus's expression never changed. His breathing remained even, controlled. A lifetime of discipline ran deep in his bones. Look at me when I'm speaking to you, Brennan demanded. Marcus's eyes slowly moved from the flag to meet the judge's gaze. There was no anger there, no fear, just a profound, unshakable calm that seemed to unnerve the judge even more. That's better, Brennan said, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. Now, let me tell you what's going to happen here. You're going to apologize to this court. You're going to accept the plea deal, and you're going to show some damn respect for the system that protects people like you. The silence stretched. Marcus said nothing. Judge Brennan's face went from red to purple. Fine, Judge Brennan spat. You want to play games? Let's talk about respect. Let's talk about duty. He pulled up a file on his computer, squinting at the screen. It says here you claim to be a veteran. Vietnam era, supposedly. He said the word supposedly with dripping sarcasm. Lisa Chen's stomach dropped. She'd seen Marcus's intake form. The box for military service had been checked, but he'd written nothing else. No branch, no rank, no details. She'd asked him about it once during their brief consultation, and he'd simply said, it was a long time ago. Let me guess, Brennan continued, warming to his theme. You sat at a desk somewhere safe. Shuffled papers. Maybe you served a few months and got out on some technicality, and now you wear it like a badge of honor, thinking it makes you special. He leaned forward, his small eyes glittering with malice. Let me tell you something about respect, old man. Real veterans, the ones who actually saw combat, who actually sacrificed, they don't act like entitled jerks in diners. They don't disrespect authority. They understand discipline. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the first sign of emotion he'd shown. You know what I think? Brennan was on a roll now. I think you're a fraud. I think you checked that box hoping for sympathy. Hoping some bleeding heart judge would go easy on you because of some imaginary service. Lisa Chen shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. My client's military service has no bearing on it. Has every bearing, Brennan roared. Because he's using it as a shield, hiding behind it like a coward. The word hung in the air like poison gas. Coward. For the first time, Marcus's hand moved. His right hand, almost unconsciously, reached up to touch his left shoulder, just below the collar. Through the thin fabric of his shirt, there was something there, a slight irregularity in the skin. Scar tissue. old and deep. Lisa had noticed it before during their meetings. The way he sometimes rolled his shoulder, as if working out ancient stiffness. She'd assumed it was arthritis, the natural decay of age. Judge Brennan saw the movement and misinterpreted it as nervousness. Oh, now I've struck a nerve, have I? Truth hurts, doesn't it? Marcus's mind slipped away from the courtroom for just a moment. The fluorescent lights became the harsh tropical sun. The smell of floor wax became the copper tang of blood and burnt gunpowder. He could hear it again, the screaming, the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades, the radio crackling with desperate voices calling for extraction. His shoulder ached with phantom pain, remembering the feeling of a bullet punching through muscle and bone, remembering the weight of Corporal Jenkins on his back as he'd carried the wounded man through 3 miles of jungle, while enemy fire chased them. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. He was back in the courtroom. The judge was still talking, still mocking, still so certain of his power. Nothing to say, Judge Brennan sneered. Just as I thought. All bark, no bite. A fake veteran and a public nuisance. Perfect combination. Lisa Chen had heard enough. While the judge droned on, cataloging all of Marcus's supposed failings, she quietly pulled out her phone beneath the table. Her hands were shaking with righteous anger. She had a contact. Her uncle, Colonel James Chen, stationed at Camp Pendleton. They weren't particularly close. She'd seen him maybe 5 times in her life, but he was her only connection to the military world. She typed quickly. Uncle James. Emergency. In San Diego Superior Court. Judge Brennan, elderly client. Claims Vietnam service. Judge calling him a fraud and a coward. Client won't defend himself. Name, Marcus Harrison. Can you check if this is real? Plea. She hit send, knowing it was a long shot. Military records. Privacy laws, decades of bureaucracy. There was no way she'd get an answer in time. But she had to The message traveled through cell towers, through military servers, landing on Colonel Chen's phone while he was in a briefing room at Camp Pendleton. He glanced at it, annoyed at the interruption, then read it more carefully. Marcus Harrison. He didn't recognize the name. He typed it into the military database on his laptop, adding Vietnam as a search parameter. The screen loaded for a moment, then went black. A single line of text appeared in red. Classified. Authorization level. Delta clearance required. Colonel Chen sat up straighter. He'd been in the military for 32 years. He'd seen plenty of classified files, but this level of classification for a name search on a supposed Vietnam veteran was extraordinary. He stood up, excusing himself from the brief. He walked quickly to his commanding officer's office, knocked once, and entered. Sir, I need you to run a name for me. High-level clearance required. Major General Patricia Morrison looked up from her desk, one eyebrow raised. What level are we talking about? Delta. The general's expression changed immediately. She moved to her secure terminal and entered her credentials. Give me the name. Marcus Harrison, Vietnam era. The general typed. The screen flickered. Then her face went pale. Jesus Christ, she whispered. What is it, man? She turned the screen so he could see. The file was heavily redacted, but what remained was enough. Harrison. Marcus MACV-SOG. Command and Control North 2000 classified missions. Silver Star 3. Bronze Star 5. Purple Heart 4. Distinguished Service Cross. Call sign Reaper 6. Where is this man right now? The general asked, her voice tight. San Diego Superior Court. A judge is apparently calling him a coward. General Morrison was on her feet, grabbing her phone. Get me a helicopter, now. And Colonel, get every officer you can find. Dress uniforms. We're going to San Diego. Back in the courtroom, Judge Brennan was preparing his final blow. He'd humiliated the old man, established his dominance. Now came the sentence. Marcus Harrison, he intoned, savoring each word. Your contempt for this court, your refusal to show proper respect, and your clear mental instability all suggest to me that you are a danger to yourself and this community. Lisa Chen's phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't dare look at it. Therefore, Brennan continued, it is the order of this court that you be remanded to County Psychiatric Facility for a 72-hour evaluation. Furthermore, Your Honor, please. Lisa stood up, her voice cracking. This is completely unnecessary. My client is competent, and one more word and you'll be disbarred for contempt, Miss Chen. The judge's voice was cold steel. Bailiff, take the defendant into custody. The bailiff, a middle-aged man named Rodriguez, who'd been working courts for 15 years, moved reluctantly toward Marcus. He'd been watching the old man throughout the hearing. There was something about him, a quality Rodriguez recognized from his own father, a Korean War veteran who'd carried himself with the same quiet dignity. "Come on, sir," Rodriguez said gently, placing a hand on Marcus's arm. "Let's make this easy." Marcus stood slowly, his joints stiff. He looked at Lisa Chen, and for the first time he spoke directly to her. "It's all right, counselor," he said quietly. "You did your best." His voice was calm, accepting. He'd faced worse than this, much worse. Judge Brennan smiled, triumphant. "Take him." The courtroom doors exploded open. Not literally, they simply swung inward with such force that they slammed against the walls. But the effect was the same. Every head in the room turned. 4 Marine officers strode into the courtroom. They were in dress blues, the most formal uniform, reserved for ceremonies and the most solemn occasions. Their shoes clicked in perfect synchronization on the tile floor. Behind them came more officers, Army, Navy, Air Force, a rainbow of service dress uniforms, each representing decades of military tradition. And at the center of this formation walked Major General Patricia Morrison, 2 stars gleaming on her shoulders, her face set in an expression of controlled fury. They didn't stop at the gallery. They walked straight down the center aisle, a military phalanx moving with inexorable purpose. Judge Brennan sat frozen, his mouth hanging open. "What is the meaning of?" General Morrison held up one hand. The gesture was small, but it carried such authority that the judge's words died in his throat. The general's eyes scanned the courtroom until they found their target. The elderly man in the faded shirt and work boots standing beside the bailiff. Her expression softened immediately. She came to attention, and every officer behind her did the same, moving as one body. Then in perfect unison, they saluted. The general's voice rang out, clear and strong. "Sergeant Major Harrison." "General Morrison, United States Marine Corps." "Sir, it is an honor." Marcus Harrison slowly, carefully, returned the salute. His weathered hand came up with the precision of muscle memory burned in over 50 years ago. The gesture was perfect, unhurried, dignified. Judge Brennan found his voice sputtering with confusion and rage. "This is highly irregular. I am conducting a legal proceeding here. You have no authority." General Morrison turned her head slowly toward the bench. Her eyes were cold as January steel. "You," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "will be silent, or I will have you removed from your own courtroom." The threat was so absurd it should have been laughable. But something in her tone made it clear she meant every word and had the power to make it happen. She turned back to Marcus, her expression softening again. "Sir, I apologize on behalf of every service member in this room for what you've endured here today. We came as soon as we heard." Colonel Chen stepped forward from the formation. "General, I have the file." Morrison nodded. She took the folder, opened it, and began to read aloud. Her voice carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. "Marcus Jerome Harrison, United States Marine Corps, enlisted 9th Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG." She paused, letting those initials sink in. For those who don't know, MACV-SOG conducted the most dangerous missions of the Vietnam War, cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia, deep reconnaissance, prisoner rescue, operations so classified that they weren't acknowledged by the U.S. government for over 20 years. She continued reading. "Sergeant Major Harrison participated in over 200 classified combat missions. He was wounded 4 times. He received the Silver Star on 3 separate occasions, 5 Bronze Stars with V device for valor, 4 Purple Heart." The general's voice grew quieter, but somehow more powerful. "On April 17, 1971, Sergeant Harrison's 12-man team was ambushed by an NVA battalion over 400 enemy soldiers. The team's radio operator was killed in the initial contact. Sergeant Harrison, already wounded, took over radio duties while coordinating their defense and calling in air support." She looked up from the file, directly at Marcus. "For 6 hours he held that position. He directed gunship runs while providing covering fire for his men. When the extraction helicopters arrived, he personally carried 2 wounded Marines to the landing zone while under continuous enemy fire. He refused to board until every one of his men, living and dead, was accounted for." Her voice cracked slightly. "For this action, Sergeant Major Marcus Harrison was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in combat that this nation can bestow. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen above the key. The citation, Morrison continued, uses words like extraordinary heroism, complete disregard for personal safety, and devotion to duty. His call sign was Reaper 6. The men who served with him, the ones who survived, still talk about him. They call him the bravest man they ever knew. She closed the file and looked directly at Judge Brennan. This is the man you called a coward. Judge Brennan's face had gone from purple to ash gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. For perhaps the first time in his judicial career, Walter Brennan had nothing to say. General Morrison wasn't finished. Your conduct today, Judge Brennan, represents not just a failure of judgment, but a fundamental failure of character. You used your authority not to pursue justice, but to demean and humiliate a man whose sacrifice you cannot begin to comprehend. Colonel Chen stepped forward, addressing the general but speaking loudly enough for all to hear. Ma'am, I've contacted the Marine Corps' Office of Legal Counsel. They're reviewing the transcript of these proceedings. They're also contacting the California State Bar and the Commission on Judicial Performance. Lisa Chen, still standing at the defense table, felt tears streaming down her face. She looked at her client, this quiet, dignified man who had sat through such abuse without once defending himself, who had been willing to go to a psychiatric facility rather than speak of his service. Marcus met her eyes and gave the slightest shake of his head. No anger, no vindication, just that same calm acceptance. One of the Marine officers, a young captain, stepped forward. Sir, he said to Marcus, his voice thick with emotion, my father served with you, Corporal David Martinez. He was one of the men you carried to the extraction point that day. Marcus's eyes widened slightly, the first real surprise he'd shown. Little Davy, he said softly. How is he? Passed away 3 years ago, sir. Cancer. But he talked about you until the very end. He said you gave him 50 more years of life. He got to see his grandchildren because of you. The young captain's voice broke. I'm in the Marines because of the stories he told about you. Sir, you're the reason I'm here. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. Your father was a good Marine, a good man. General Morrison turned back to the bench. Judge Brennan, I believe you have some decisions to make, starting with dismissing all charges against Sergeant Major Harrison with prejudice. Brennan's hand trembled as he reached for his gavel. Case dismissed, with prejudice. His voice was barely a whisper. Louder, the general commanded. Case dismissed with prejudice. Brennan's voice cracked like a teenage boy's. Morrison nodded. Sergeant Major Harrison, would you honor us by allowing us to escort you from this courtroom? Marcus stood slowly, his old joints protesting. That's not necessary, General. I can walk out on my own. With respect, sir, Morrison said gently. We know you can, but we'd like to do this anyway, for us, for every Marine who's ever worn the uniform. Marcus looked at the formation of officers standing at attention in their dress uniform, young faces and old, all looking at him with such profound respect it was almost painful to witness. All right, he said quietly, let's go home. The procession that left the courtroom was unlike anything San Diego Superior Court had ever seen. General Morrison walked beside Marcus, with Colonel Chen on his other side. The formation of officers fell in behind them, creating an honor guard. As they moved through the courthouse corridors, word spread like wildfire. Court employees emerged from offices. Other attorneys stepped out of courtrooms. Security guards stood at attention. Someone started clapping, then another. Then another. Within moments, hallway erupted in applause. Marcus kept his eyes forward, his face impassive, but his hands trembled slightly. This was harder than the judge's insults. Praise had always been harder to accept than criticism. They emerged into the bright California sunshine. A crowd had gathered outside. The story was already spreading through social media, text messages, the mysterious network that makes news travel at light speed. A local news crew was setting up. The reporter, a young woman with a microphone, tried to approach. Sergeant Major Harrison, can we get a statement? General Morrison stepped between them. No comment. The Sergeant Major's privacy will be respected. They walked to the waiting vehicles, a small convoy of military cars. Before getting in, Marcus turned to Lisa Chen, who had followed them out. Miss Chen, he said, thank you for believing in me. even when you didn't know why. Lisa wiped her eyes. Sir, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell the judge? You could have ended this in 5 minutes. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Because it happened 50 years ago. Those medals, that service. It was just me doing my job. I'm not that young Marine anymore. I'm just an old man who stood up for a waitress. He smiled slightly. Besides, if I'd mentioned it, the judge might have thought I was using it as an excuse. Like he said, hiding behind it. I won't do that. Those days, that service, it belongs to the men who didn't come home. Not to me. General Morrison placed a hand on his shoulder. With respect, sir, it belongs to all of you. The living and the dead, and the living have a duty to honor the truth. Marcus nodded slowly. Maybe so. Colonel Chen approached. Sir, we'd like to arrange a formal ceremony recognition from the Marine Corps. The Medal of Honor Society. The Marcus held up his hand. No ceremonies. No recognition. I just want to go home to my family. The general exchanged glances with the colonel. We understand, but at minimum, we'd like to ensure that Judge Brennan faces appropriate consequences, and we'd like to clear your record completely. No arrest, no charges, nothing. The charges are dismissed. Marcus said, That's enough, sir. General Morrison, Marcus said, his voice carrying just a hint of command. I'm asking, please, I just want to go home. The general came to attention and saluted. Yes, sir. Judge Walter Brennan sat alone in his chambers, his hands shaking. The courtroom had cleared. The officers were gone. The defendant, the decorated war hero he'd called a coward, was gone. But the consequences were just beginning. His computer pinged with new emails. One from the California Commission on Judicial Performance, one from the state bar, one from the county's chief judge, with the subject line, Immediate meeting required. His phone buzzed. A text from the court administrator, Don't talk to press. Don't make statements. Attorney will contact you. He'd been a judge for 12 years. He'd built his career on being tough, on not tolerating nonsense, on maintaining order in his courtroom. But somewhere along the way, toughness had become cruelty. Authority had become tyranny. He pulled up the video recording of the hearing. All California courts recorded proceedings. He forced himself to watch. There he was, red-faced and bombastic, mocking an elderly man who sat in dignified silence, calling him a fraud, a coward, using his power not to pursue justice, but to inflate his own ego. And Marcus Harrison's face, calm, accepting, showing no anger even as he was publicly humiliated. Brennan had seen that expression before. His own father had worn it sometime. His father, a Vietnam veteran who'd never talked about his service, who'd carried invisible wounds until they'd killed him at 62. Had his father been like Harrison, had he carried untold horrors behind that same quiet dignity? Had young lawyers and judges dismissed him too, never knowing what he'd endured? Brennan put his head in his hands and for the first time in decades, wept. 3 days later, Walter Brennan submitted his resignation from the bench. He didn't wait for the investigation to conclude. He didn't try to fight it. He simply wrote a 1-paragraph letter. I am resigning effective immediately. My conduct toward Mr. Marcus Harrison was inexcusable and represents a fundamental failure to uphold the dignity of the judicial office. I have no defense for my actions and will not attempt to make one. I am deeply sorry. He signed it, sealed it, and hand-delivered it to the chief judge's office. Then he did something he'd never done before. He drove to Camp Pendleton and asked to speak to General Morrison. She agreed to see him, though her aide made it clear it was against her better judgment. He stood in her office, this man who'd wielded such power in his courtroom, now diminished and ashamed. General, I don't expect forgiveness, he said. I don't deserve, but I needed to say in person that I'm sorry. What I did was unforgivable. Morrison studied him with cold eyes. You're right. It was unforgivable. You humiliated a man who's given more for this country than you could understand. You used your power to belittle someone who couldn't defend himself without breaking a lifetime of humility. She paused. But Sergeant Major Harrison asked us not to pursue this. He said you'd learned your lesson. So I'm honoring his request. Brennan nodded. Can you give him something for me? He held out an envelope. Morrison took it. I'll make sure he gets it. 2 weeks later, Marcus Harrison was in his small backyard garden, tending to his tomato plants, when his granddaughter Emma brought him an envelope. Grandpa, this came in the mail. It says it's from Judge Brennan. Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans and took the envelope. He recognized the return address, not the courthouse, but a residential address. He opened it slowly. Dear Mr. Harrison, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect you to. I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away unopened. I'm writing because I need you to know that I understand what I did. Not just the legal wrongness of it, but the moral failure. I used my authority to demean someone I should have respected. I made assumptions about a man I knew nothing about. I called you a coward when the truth is I don't have a fraction of the courage you've shown. My father was a Vietnam veteran. He never talked about his service. He died when I was 30, and I never really knew him. I think maybe he was like you, carrying things he couldn't speak about. Maybe if I'd understood that, I would have been a better son and a better judge. I've resigned from the bench. I'm not looking for sympathy. It's the least I deserved. I'm taking time to figure out who I want to be without the robe and the power. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that you taught me something important. True strength is quiet. Real courage doesn't announce itself, and sometimes the smallest person in the room is the biggest. I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison. Truly and deeply sorry. Walter Brennan. Marcus read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Emma was watching him. What did he say, Grandpa? He said he was sorry. Are you going to forgive him? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his tomato plant. Forgiveness isn't really mine to give, sweetie. He didn't hurt me, not really. He just showed who he was. But I think he's trying to become someone better. That's harder than staying who you were. Did you write back? Marcus shook his head. Don't need to. He said what he needed to say. That's enough. But later that evening, Marcus did write something. Not to Brennan, but to Captain Martinez, the young Marine whose father had served with him. Dear Captain Martinez, it was good to see you. Your father would be proud of the man you've become. I'm sorry I didn't stay in touch with him after we came home. The truth is, I tried to put those days behind me, but maybe that was wrong. Maybe the memories, even the hard ones, are important to keep. If you're ever in San Diego, I'd be honored if you'd come by for coffee. I'd like to hear more about your father's life after the war, the good years he got to have. Semper Fi, Marcus Harrison. 6 months later, Marcus Harrison stood in front of 40 young Marines at Camp Pendleton. General Morrison had asked him, very politely, if he would speak to a leadership class. He'd refused twice. She'd asked a third time. Just tell them your story, she'd said. These kids need to understand what service really means. So here he was in a classroom full of eager young faces, feeling more nervous than he'd felt in Judge Brennan's courtroom. I'm not good at speeches, he began. Never have been, but the general asked me to talk about leadership. So I'll tell you what I know. He looked around the room. Leadership isn't about rank. It's not about being the loudest or the toughest. It's about taking care of the people who depend on you. That's it. That's the whole job. He told them about Firebase Dakota, about the ambush, about the 6 hours of hell. But he didn't tell it like a war story. He told it like a lesson. I was scared the whole time, he's absolutely terrified. I kept thinking I was going to die, but I had 11 Marines depending on me to get them home. That's what kept me going. Not courage, not training, just the knowledge that if I quit, they died. He paused. Some of you will go to war, some won't, but all of you will face moments when people are depending on you, when it's easier to quit than to keep going, when nobody would blame you for walking away. In those moments, remember this: the most important thing you can do is the right thing, even when nobody's watching, even when you'll never get credit, especially when it costs you something. One young Marine raised his hand. Sir, when the judge was disrespecting you, why didn't you tell him who you were? You could have shut him down immediately. Marcus smiled slightly. Because who I was 50 years ago doesn't make me special now. Those medals, that service, they represent the worst and best days of my life, but they don't give me the right to use them like a club. Real honor is quiet. It doesn't demand recognition. After the class, Captain Martinez approached. Sir, there's someone here who wants to meet you. A man in his 70s stood nearby, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap. His eyes were wet. Reaper 6, he said, his voice shaking. I'm Bobby Chen, Firebase Dakota. You carried me to the chopper. I was the one with the leg wound. Marcus stared at him. Little Bobby Chen, who'd screamed in pain for 6 hours, who Marcus had sworn was going to die, who'd somehow miraculously survived. They embraced. Two old men who'd been young together in hell. I never got to thank you, Chen. I've spent 50 years looking for you. You don't need to thank me, Marcus said. You made it home. That's all the thanks I needed. But Chen shook his head. You gave me 50 years, Marcus. I got to raise children, see grandchildren, live a life, because of you. They stood there in the California sunshine. Two old warriors who'd survived when they shouldn't have, surrounded by young Marines who represented the future they'd helped build. And Marcus Harrison, who'd never wanted recognition, who'd sat silently through abuse rather than trumpet his service, finally allowed himself to feel what he'd earned so long ago, pride. Not in the medals or the commendations, but in the men who'd lived because he'd refused to quit, in the families that existed because he'd done his job. That night, Marcus wrote one more letter, to Judge Brennan. Walter, I got your letter. I appreciate you writing it. You asked if I forgave you. That's not the right question. The right question is, have you forgiven yourself? Because if you're going to become the man you want to be, you'll need to. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. I hear you've been volunteering with a veterans organization. That's good. Keep doing that. Those men need people who care. Maybe someday our paths will cross again. If they do, I'll buy you a coffee. Marcus Harrison. 3 years later, at a veterans event in San Diego, they did meet again. Brennan was helping to organize a program for veterans navigating the legal system. Marcus was there with Captain Martinez. They shook hands. Two men who'd once been on opposite sides of power. Now just two people trying to do some good in the world. Thank you, Brennan said simply. For what? For showing me what real strength looks like. Marcus just nodded, because that was the thing about true strength. It didn't need to announce itself. It just endured.